experiments for sociocracy when your organization isn't ready to embrace sociocracy. And that is a very common situation, of course. It happens very rarely. It does happen nowadays, but it happens very rarely that an organization starts out sociocratically. So eventually somebody needs to bring it, and I'll talk about how that typically goes at the end. But for now, I want to give you a few words of introduction, and then I want to talk about the 3 experiments that we can do that I think are useful and are a good on-ramp into using even more of sociocracy. And then I will show you where in the adoption process one is if one does all those things without formally adopting it, and what could potentially come next, so that you also get a sense of what to play and look out for next if you want to move along more in that direction. So introduction. There's a comparison that I use quite a bit to explain to people, because there's something very particular about governance methods, different from almost anything else that you can introduce in an organization. So a word that I use is there's software, there's hardware. Software is anything that can be changed without changing the underlying structure. Like, for example, and I'll talk about that more, you can start a meeting with a check-in. That doesn't change the power structure, at least not directly. Indirectly, it might. But really, everybody who's still in charge is still in charge, but now you're having a little bit of a nicer start of a meeting, okay? But we're not changing who decides what. And that's kind of the plumbing that we're not changing if we're only changing those software level practices. Then hardware, easy to guess, is exactly all the things that change when we actually change the formal power structure in the organization. This is important to understand for this talk today, because experiment can only change the software. It will always still be within the current context of the current system. We have to be very clear about that. Otherwise, people get disappointed or get quasi or like semi implementations of sociocracy and are then wondering why it's not working. But I will go into that. Here's another metaphor, just kind of playing with metaphors to see what clicks with people. A governance system is like a language, and it really is. I think about that a lot, but also disclaimer, I'm a linguist by training, so there we are. That's what's on my mind. So if you think about languages are like a complete set of grammar, words, patterns of pronunciation and sounds and culture, all of it, right? It kind of is one big complex mush of things. Now, if you imagine that you use one German word, because I'm German, one German word within an English sentence doesn't mean that all of a sudden you speak German. Changing one word doesn't change the fact that you just plugged it into an English sentence, okay? Even if the person spoke German fluently, this is still an English sentence, even though it has a German word in it. Just like a hierarchical system is still a hierarchical system, even if you do rounds. I just want to be absolutely clear about this so that there are no misconceptions about what sociocracy is. It's a change in power structure. It's a deeper change, and we can still talk about what we can do before. One thing about that is, I think that that metaphor, that comparison with language is very intriguing, actually. If you think about it, languages are for communication. Governance systems are for collaboration. They still have a lot of artifacts and kind of mechanism and deeper patterns of how things work so that human brains understand them. That's something that I'm very interested in, just because that's what I pay attention to. And the system, of course, matters. You might have heard that quote from me actually yesterday. You can't outlove your lack of governance. The system will set the general behaviors, what is rewarded and what is not rewarded, and so on. We'll get a little bit more to that later. So we have to acknowledge what the general system is. And that said, here is what we can move and shift a little bit at least. So where we want to go overall in a sociocratic system is to move towards small or more defined and more clearly identified manageable groups that take on decisions. If, for example, a community runs by large group consensus, everybody decides together, right? We want to turn that into smaller, more action-oriented decision-making groups. If we have a system where the executive director decides, or the CEO, we want to have a more participatory system where there's more people deciding together. And if we have no idea who actually decides, that exists, quite common. If we don't actually know who decides, we want to have clarity on who decides. So generally, no matter where you come from, if the goal is sociocracy or some tools from sociocracy, then it is having a defined set of people with a defined set of decision-making power. That's the general direction, no matter which place we come from. And also, what we want is a system where it's where all the different parts of the system are set up to give us power with. That has to do with clarity, who decides what. What we say is what we do, and what we do is what we say. So that has to do with decision making. It has to do with honesty about our system, clarity on where the system comes from and who can change it, and so on. And you might notice this is really important to me because I see it so much. I find that this is very hard to do in an incremental approach. You can inch your way towards that, and I think there has to be a moment of official acknowledgement, but I'll say that about 3 more times, so we'll get there. Now, let's look at the experiments that we can do. There are 3 sets. One is rounds and meetings, the other one is consent, and the third one is distributed decision-making. So this is the first one of the ones that I'll cover. So why would we do rounds? And that is just talking one by one, as you can see in the image. Why would we want that? Well, because in a typical organization, only a few of the people speak. So we want to get more of the voices out into the open so that we hear what people are thinking and needing. So overall, it is more of an orientation towards the collective instead of bouncing around from individual kind of subjective opinion to subjective opinion. Because in a typical, what we call debate style situation, where everybody speaks who just is feeling like they might be next, then it's often that people speak very much kind of like, no, that's not how I see it, or like, no, that's not what we should do. You know, people get into a little bit of an antagonistic habit. And if you slow that down and say, how about everybody speaks, you kind of open the space for people to think about themselves in the context of the group, and they have more mental space for thinking for that collective. That is just something that we see again and again that just happens because all of a sudden you create that space. So overall, ideally, then just the way of talking to each other becomes more intentional. So let's go over that just for a moment here. What do I mean when I say rounds? As I said, it's a simple practice of talking one by one until all have spoken. And by all, I mean all in the circle. So this is geared towards group sizes of between 3 and 8, maybe 9, 10 if you absolutely have to, but I don't enjoy meetings in a group of 10. I don't even enjoy meetings in a group of 9 or 8, honestly. So then the facilitator, for example, this person, will say, hey, we just heard this new idea. Let's do a round on what people think. And then people will speak one by one, the facilitator as well. And when everybody has spoken, we can decide whether we want to do another round. One can use rounds for all kinds of purposes. For example, you can do reaction rounds where people share their reactions to something. You can also do questions rounds where people can ask questions about something that you've presented. And there's also consent rounds, which we'll get to. So rounds, just as a general mode of speaking, are pretty brilliant, honestly. And it's also not unique to sociocracy, just acknowledging that circle practices are probably as old as humanity itself. So this is not rocket science. Everybody can pull this off. Now, if you are in a group that does not typically talk in rounds, it's actually, although it's so ridiculously easy, not so easy to shift the culture. You don't just do that like that really quick. So it needs reminders and enforcement. But one thing to try is to just say, hey, can we make sure to hear from everybody on this? But then if somebody jumps in and skips or talks again before everybody has spoken, it needs a reminder of like, oh, actually, before you go a second time, can we first hear from so-and-so? Like, people are not aware of how much they're monopolizing time. So that needs feedback, and feedback means you have to speak up and say it. Some people then ask, can we use a talking stick? You can absolutely use a talking stick, whatever you do that helps you, whatever fits into your culture. If you are in a boardroom, you might not want to use a talking stick. If you are in a group of people who want to do that, absolutely go for it. Next is meetings. That's still in the same category here. Again, what we can do in meetings is create that intentionality around how we speak, but also what our format is. I'm always aiming for more accountability, actually, more transparency, and with that shared power that we hope for. And this is actually really boring because all I want is for people to follow a simple checklist. Go through it one by one. Let's check in. Let's do a little housekeeping. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about. Let's talk about those things. Let's talk about what comes up in the future. And then let's see how this meeting went. It is not rocket science at all. And people have a really hard time with it. And I think that is because they are often unaware of what their mind is doing right now. We're all so used to having a thought and then just saying it. And this moment of slowing down of, does that fit here right now? Is this what the group needs to hear right now? Often people have not learned to make that step. So that is something that sociocracy or not already can improve meetings quite a bit. Since people often have not learned how to follow a meeting format or have never seen a meeting format, it is often just brand new information that such a thing exists. If you ask me, I would say we should all be taught or told that by 7th grade, maybe 6th grade, maybe even 4th grade. A meeting format is really not hard. We learn to write essays. We can learn how to facilitate a meeting. Let's see, what else is there to say? Yeah, let's go to limitations. So as I've been emphasizing several times now, we can change one piece of the puzzle. And yet, if you have a puzzle and you change one puzzle piece, it's simply not going to fit anymore, right? Because in a hierarchical system or everybody decides everything together kind of system, if you change one piece, it's now out of alignment with the rest, either culturally or actually just the pure logistics of it. So here are a few things that we notice when we tinker with the rounds and meeting format. Here are a few things that can come up. The first one is it can feel performative if the input isn't taking up. Let's say you have a boss that asks, hey, let's do a round on what everybody's thinking, but then they just do whatever they want to do. Rounds are not going to shift culture if that's the case. Like, rounds can do a lot, but they're not magic, right? I mean, so the formal system will still be in the way because that person has formal power. It only works in small groups. If you have a system that is set up that forces you to make a decision with 60 people, you can probably not do rounds, or only one within a 2-hour meeting. So then your system is just needs other things. You can't just use rounds and meeting structure and expect that it will fix everything. It runs into pretty big issues there. Some organizations or some people reject it as too formal. You know, when you're telling them, sorry, actually, we're in a round right now, would you hold that thought? They're like, oh, this is so formal. I can't say whatever I want. This is not creative, blah, 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 blah. Heard all these things 1,000 times and never convinces me. Because typically what those people mean is, I want to speak whenever I want to speak. What sociocracy does is it shifts from individual to group to hold those two in balance. But if people are used to be basically thinking about themselves instead of for the group, then yes, that is different from your conditioning. That's exactly the point. But then people, you know, find all these reasons of why it's a bad system because they do not ultimately want to prioritize the group over themselves. So that's why that doesn't convince me. If like, yeah, I see that's where you're at, and that's not where I want to be. The other piece is, as I said, that people lack self-awareness of why they're talking right now and what they should be talking about. Like, what's on right now? And I know that's hard. I know it's hard. We all want to just say whatever we're thinking at any given moment. And for example, just yesterday, I was doing homework with my 14-year-old. And they learn these things, right, of like how to write an essay, how to write, you know, like how to answer a question about history. And they learn first you write a sentence of introduction, then you write your statement, and then you explain it, and so on. You know, we've all been trained how to communicate effectively. Then why don't we take that kind of knowledge and that kind of expectation into a meeting? We can totally learn what is appropriate when and in what order to say things. We can totally learn that. But some people go right there and just dismiss it as too formal. And again, it does not convince me. So if you have that, you can try and do convincing. And I think if people aren't there, they aren't there. It can lack depth. So especially rounds, meetings in general, when everybody just tries to read the boss's mind, right? That's very similar to the performative here. Like, great, now you did rounds, but you did a round of everybody's trying to say what the boss wants to hear. That's not what I mean when I say a round. It lacks that participatory aspect because now we're still in a monoculture of thought. And it can reveal power over power under dynamics. And then we kind of left hanging there. What I mean is, let me give you an example for both. Power over, I sort of already gave an example when we have the boss that speaks, right? And then everybody else just whatever, either doesn't say anything meaningful or just says what they think they want to hear, or everybody says what they want to say, but then it's not taken up. But there's also a fair bit of power over behavior that is, for example, status posing, repeating yourself as if that made it truer what you're saying, or more important. A common one is power under behavior. For example, people, and I'm sure half of us are in that camp, sometimes it's me. If you say something, you know, in a round, and then you say at the end, yeah, I don't know, that's just what I'm thinking. Like, now you just undermined your own thing. Why would you do that? Like, you brought a piece. Why would you dismiss it right after you said it? But there's a lot of power under behaviors that I think we need to be aware of, that where we basically undo the advantage that doing a round brought. Okay. Next one. So that was 1 out of 3. Consent. For those of you who don't know, consent is the decision-making method that we use for policy decisions. Sometimes people think that we use them for all decisions. That's not true. We use them for policy decisions. I'll say more about how that works, but just in general, we use them for all of the decisions that put in place like the general system in which then we operate and make decisions on our own. For example, we might put a role in place that empowers me to do a certain thing. Putting that role in place and putting me into that role is a consent decision. But from then on, I can make the decisions in that role without having to check with my team. Okay. So not each and every decision, like, should I write that email right now? I don't know. Let's ask 5 people for consent. That's not how it works. All right, but why would we even use consent decision making where a group decides together? Well, it depends on where you come from. If you come from a hierarchical system, we often are in a situation where if just one person, like the boss decides, right, we have that monoculture of thought, right, because we do whatever that person thinks is good. And now with consent, we can have more people speak and actually object to proposals or bring proposals in the first place. We have more alignment because if something that we're deciding doesn't work for my part of the team, then I can object. That is not the case if it's heavily hierarchical. And we have a system of co-responsibility instead of just blaming everything on the boss. Because if you get to decide, that also means now you're on the hook. If you come from a place where you have a hard time making decisions in the first place, consent often brings more intentionality, so you know how to move towards a decision more easily. And it can also be more inclusive because it's more clear how to say no. So consent works the following way. If I ask, do you consent? Then some of you might think, oh, that's what I want. What Ted just proposed is what I want. That's great. Yes. It can also mean that you say, that's not what I wanted, but it sounds like an okay plan. Let's do it. Nothing wrong with it. Those two things, everything in green is consent. So you can consent to things that were not your first choice. An objection is to say, whoa, this actually doesn't work. So for any given decision, policy decision, you either consent or you object if it's in your circle. There are also these different steps, around how you go through a decision-making method, like through a decision here by presenting the proposal, asking for reactions. Like there's kind of a 1, 2, 3 step situation. So consent is a good idea if you struggle with going from bouncing ideas to making a decision, because we're aiming for good enough, which means we can talk less and get to a decision faster. It's also typically broader acceptance than autocratic decisions and that clarity that I already mentioned. So that's all great, but now let's say your organization doesn't use consent. Sorry. Let's say your organization doesn't use consent. How do you nudge in that direction? Well, one very simple thing is, oh, sorry, I'll get some water. Give me 1 second. Where was I? Oh, one thing is to change the way you ask. So instead of asking, should we do this? Which typically means that people will think, is that my preference? No. And then they'll say no. Ask, is there any reason not to do it? Because then you're asking for objections, which means if I sit there and the proposal is not my first choice, but my second choice, and you ask me, should we do this? I'll say no, because I want this other thing. If you ask me, is there any reason not to do this thing? And it's my second choice, I'll say, no, there's no reason not to do it. Which means now I've said yes, because not objecting means consenting. So just the way you ask the question completely changes the system. And that you can do. Like you can do that. Like I do that with my kids, for example. They've never opted into consent. But I ask them, instead of asking, is this what you want? I ask, okay, tell me, is there any reason not to do it? No? Okay, then let's just do it. You can also focus on experimentation. Like you can do things like, hey, how about we try this for a while? That way, you go more to the good enough for now kind of mindset where you try something out to see if it's good enough. The problem with that is that if you're not in a context where you have some follow through, trying something for a while sometimes just means you don't want to talk about it more. So it's not really honest. If I mean, can we try something for a while? I really mean that. And then I have a term, and after that term, I will check in again and so on. Like it needs action, like it's a promise into the future that you need to be able to keep. And not all organizations are organized enough to promise that. So that's one of the limitations in a system that isn't set up in this way. Some more limitations, quite a few limitations around consent, although it's often the first thing that people adopt. That's not true. Rounds are the first thing that people adopt. But consent. So if the aim is unclear, it's hard to use consent. If you can't say this, I object because this creates some sort of mismatch with our aim, because you don't know what the aim is, now you're kind of just floating around. You don't know what you can say yes or no to. There's no backdrop to actually evaluate a proposal. This is a subtle one. This might be a little bit too advanced for this context, but I still want to explain it really quick. If you have a group of people, half of the members, sometimes in organizations, are kind of people who just sit there because they have opinions, they're not actually doing anything. If people's participation in the meeting is not based on actual doing, they sometimes have more outlandish ideas on what works and what doesn't, which means it's going to be hard to get to a decision with them. Sometimes you have that strong sense of, oh, the doers want one thing, and the opinionated people that are not doers are like, I don't know, should we do anything? So a shared sense of doing is a huge unifier. But that means your circle membership has to be aligned with who's doing things. And that's often not how organizations operate. They operate by, oh, whoever wants to weigh in on this should be a part of it, or whoever is more important should have a part in this decision. All of that sets it already up in a different style than sociocracy is designed to do, because sociocracy is governance by those who do things together. Again, that's subtle. If that goes like this, that's fine. You would notice it after a while. It can, using consent outside of a sociocratic organization can reveal power structures if we're asked to consent on something we don't really have decision-making authority over. A little story on that is I was asked to teach consent to librarians at a university, and I almost refused to do it. Why? Because they have literally no decision-making in the departments. Why would I teach them how to make a decision if they just notice through me teaching them that there's nothing they can make decisions about? I just didn't want to, like, that's miserable. And that's very real, and they did notice it there. Like, it was really in their face when we talked about it. It turned out to be okay in that actual situation, because at least they are now able to make decisions on what recommendations or demands they make for and against, like, other people. It still is a problem, right? So you can't say in a hierarchical situation, oh, let's make a decision by consent, if your boss can just override anything you do. That's not how consent is designed. Consent is hard to do in large groups. I've already sort of talked to that with rounds, and it's hard to get actual buy-in. So sometimes I read that people are like, oh, let's make decisions by consent, and if it doesn't work, then let's just vote. I get that. And let's think about the situation for a moment. Let's say, you know, somebody brings a proposal and I'm against it, but I'm in the minority. Let's say I'm the only one who's against it, but I have really good reasons. Okay. Now I object, and now we talk about it, right? And we don't really come to a solution, and then we table it to next meeting, same situation, and then we go to our fallback. And now we go to a vote, and I'm just overruled. Okay. That undermines everything that is important about consent, because you need to be able to trust that your objection will be taken seriously. If everybody just has to sit it out, they're not going to engage with my objection. So the whole thing is completely moot. It's like there's no point to it. You just slow down a process of voting that you would have done anyway. So then be honest and just do that. Then consent is just a facade. All right. Last one, distributing authority. So we want to get into a situation, ideally, where more people are deciding more things autonomously in more places. And ideally, that means that more things are getting decided, which means more things are moving forward. Ideally, that also means people who typically complain about a thing can now take action because we've empowered them to do something. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, a non-Sociocratic system, for example, a hierarchical system, or any kind of system where power doesn't actually lie with the smaller groups, typically doesn't have a system of actually giving real authority to somebody. They can delegate something, but the fallback is still that if we don't like what you decided, we're going to take it. Like if, for example, my boss tells me, hey, Ted, how about you know, take on this project and decide all the things that have to do with that. And I do that. And then the boss comes and says, oh, wait, that's what you're doing? No, you're not allowed to do that. Okay. So that's typically how delegation works. But Sociocratic way of distributing authority is like distributing the real decision making, like the ultimate decision making, like you are actually the decision maker. So it's a complete different game, actually. That said, we can ask for more pre-permissioning on a one-by-one basis. So we can ask, okay, how about on this one project, Ted just gets to decide, and even if we don't like it, we'll accept it. That is possible within limitations. So we can empower a group, we can empower an individual. They have this gold dust here because they're now empowered to make decisions. So this is basically what I just said. Can we empower this person to work on this and do what needs doing and make decisions about it and so on? Or we can also create like a somewhat arbitrary boundary, like say they only come back if there's a problem that's a little squishy, or a certain threshold, right? So, and some of that happens in hierarchical organizations, and yet we always know that our boss could override us, but you know, some of that does, of course, happen. Now, limitations, I've already alluded to them. So what we need in order to let this team decide things on their own is we need this umbrella, which I've heard talked about as a shit umbrella. So basically, in order to protect this team, this person here, the person above that, needs to be on board to protect that team, even if things get a little rough. Otherwise, if this boss just pulls the plug on this project whenever they feel like it, they are not really empowered to make decisions. So one can parcel out authority in non-Sociocratic system, but then all the stars have to align, basically. So all that given power that we've given them remains conditional. You know, you can decide by yourself if you're reading my mind. So watch out for that, because one of the problems for all of that is that that people know exactly when they're actually responsible. If I know that my boss is going to rewrite my PowerPoint presentation how much effort I'm going to put into it. It's going to be that boss's anyway. Like, so, but if I know it's me and it's going to remain me and I'm going to be responsible, I'm going to put much more effort into it. Like, we know when responsibility is real and when it's just a facade. So ideally, we really make it real. And then when people also step up, if we don't make it real, it's kind of this conditional situation that just doesn't really become real. Okay. Then another piece, just, yeah, that's a little hard to explain, but sometimes what happens is that people are delegated authority. They can make this project happen, but they have no say on all the things that touch that. Like, you can make this project, but you don't have a say on the website, on the project, and the budget, and this and that. We're like, okay, now I have to do so many things, but half of the things I don't get to decide because they're somewhere else, and that gets hard. Okay, last 2 or 3 minutes. So now, given all of that, these are things to play with, right? These are things to play with about meetings and rounds, consent, and getting your groups to give away some of the power, at least temporarily. But I promise to embed that in the overall adoption process. And this is a picture of the overall adoption process that, by the way, I'm very happy with. So typically how a good implementation works is somebody brings it up in the organization, says, hey, I heard about this thing. It's called Sociocracy. Shall we look at that? And then let's say the train moves on, and now we form an implementation circle that works on the implementation. They now take this little detour and they work on a circle structure and a governance agreement, a transition plan. They have a good set of feedback loops with the organization, so they plan something that the others will like. And then the organization formally opts in, and now the organization is sociocratic, indicated by green. And then we roll out and improve. Now, if we're still playing with things, where we are is here, right? So all the things I talked about were imagining that we were here. We don't have an official buy-in. We don't even have a plan for implementing. We're just kind of playing with things. And that's totally fine, right? With all the limitations, but we're on the way somewhere. So we can do training, we can practice all those things that I talked about, and we can kind of build the muscles so that then we can build momentum, and maybe with that also convince the people who are ultimately the deciders that might feel more courageous if we do a really good job at practicing those things. Like, we can kind of prove that we're ready by doing all those things that we can do really well. And here you can see also with everything in green here, the tracks in green, that is what it takes for that formal hardware change. You need a plan for what you're changing your hardware to. And then you need to actually change the hardware, like the plumbing, the wiring, whatever, who decides what and how do we decide who decides what, then gets really changed. This is what I would call then a sociocratic system, not an organization that does rounds and consent. To me, it's about who holds the power. Anyway, so I thought that might be interesting for you to see where you are when you're still playing, so to speak. And one can be playing for years. Know that what you ultimately, if you want to move on, what you ultimately want to go towards is to get the deciders to say, yes, we're willing to have a team that looks at how it would look, what it would look like to use this for real. That should be your goal. All right, training resources. We have, which is, I think, good for this moment in time that we're talking about. We have a set of pre-recorded videos that move a group. It kind of goes back and forth between watching a video together and doing an exercise, and kind of going back and forth several times. And there's 4 sessions of that, about 2 hours each. That's a really great way to start and build some momentum with a smaller group of allies in the organization. So if you're the one who is just thinking about this alone in your organization and is interested in it, find 3 other people that you can convince to be a little interested enough to look at this. And this has often been used by groups to build momentum kind of bit by bit. If you want to learn and you want to gain some more experience to be kind of the in-house resource, we have a 5-month program, like 2 hours a week, called Academy. Starts in February again, and that's a good idea. It's common that people in that position will attend Academy. So you'd be in good company. And then, of course, we also go into organizations and do the convincing if somebody opens a door for us. We're happy to talk to bosses, boards, whatever, with all of their concerns. We typically have heard all those things before, and we typically know how to take that seriously, but also have something useful to say. There's books. Many Voices, One Song might be a little too detailed for this moment, but there's these easier reads, and I will give you the link to the slides, and it's linked on there. You just have to click. And Who Decides Who Decides is a book just about how to start. Like starting a group that is not fully functional yet. And there we are.